to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be talking about what we can do to provide global solutions to many of the problems of the world that impact us locally. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Rebecca Shute is the Executive Director of Citizens for Global Solutions. She is an international lawyer and democracy and governance practitioner with extensive experience supporting human rights, democratic processes, and the rule of law on 5 continents. Rebecca Shute, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill, and thank you for your patience as well. We've tried to schedule this for a while, and in homage to that very first attempt when I was in The Hague, the city of peace and justice, I have bring you The Hague with me today by
That's
virtue.
one wonderful backdrop. It's great. Well, wonderful. Well, again, thanks so much. I'm glad it worked out. Give us a little overview of Citizens for Global Solutions. What is it? When was it formed? What is your main purpose?
Thanks. So CGS is a non-governmental, nonprofit, nonpartisan, membership-based organization. And we were founded in 1947. You might remember some of the bold-faced names that were our early champions: Albert Einstein, J. Robert Oppenheimer, William Fulbright, Clare Boothe Luce, just to name a few. Also, in addition to statespersons and scientists, some prominent figures from the arts that were seized of the idea of a better way forward for global governance. And so today we continue with chapters across the United States, and we are a member of the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy, which is a worldwide coalition of organizations that band together to advocate for democratic world federation.
Very good. And when you say global governance, I think a lot of people have a misunderstanding of the definition of global governance. You're not talking about global control, global governments reigning over people in individual countries. That is totally different, isn't it?
Yes, I think that is the greatest misconception, that global governance would entail some CEO, some executive, some monomaniacal character, usually a man in a suit with a white beard. No offense to men in suits. I'm sorry, Bill. Who is
None
governing
taken,
the
none
world.
taken.
As opposed to a democratic system predicated on federalism. So what does that mean, predicated on federalism? Well, we in the United States are quite, I think, familiar, more so than other countries in some instances, with what it looks like to have subsidiarity in government, that we have local government, we have state government, we have national government. In some instances, we belong to regional structures, and of course, there are global institutions to which we belong today. My organizations and like-minded organizations, as well as like-minded states and other actors, believe that those global institutions need to be strengthened to really encapsulate democracy across all levels of government, to achieve the aims of human rights and to appreciate rule of law. So this is basically a global version of what happened in the United States in 1788, when the 13 original states became a federation by abandoning the failed Articles of Confederation and ratifying the US Constitution. And so there are, of course, necessary instruments and necessary institutions to effect this. But rather, instead of centralizing power in unelected or perhaps remote authorities, this system of government, a democratic world federation, aims to, from the bottom up and from the top down, bring principles of democracy throughout the world. And we know too well that so many citizens of the world are failed by their national governments, and it should not be incumbent upon them to fight their systems alone. And that's why we see global cooperation as the only way forward.
It certainly is. And these problems, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about immigration, we're talking about transportation, moving ships, aircraft, mail, weather information all around the world. These have to be done globally with a coordinated effort. And of course, the key coordinator of all that's the United Nations system, which is involved in everything that I mentioned and a lot more. How do you focus on the United Nations, and what do you perceive as the role for the UN? And I know it's a large family of UN agencies. We couldn't talk about all of them, but how do you perceive the UN system in general?
Absolutely. Well, I will just point out, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the post office. We think about these global challenges of pandemics, of crimes of aggression, of climate change, and we often take for granted that among the very first working global institutions was we take an international post office. The world can't run without global cooperation. So going back to your question, the United Nations system, one thing that I think is often assumed is that the United Nations is impermeable and that it's preserved in ember. But in fact, the United Nations Charter was always envisioned as a living document. In 1945, enshrined in the Charter via Articles 108 and 109 was the expectation that it would be reviewed, that this would go on to evolve with the times, to evolve with generations, to evolve with the challenges of the day. And so, for example, my organization belongs to something called the Coalition for the United Nations We Need, which coalesced around the 50th anniversary of the United Nations and by a different name. And today takes forward what I think we'll talk about in a little while, a seminal opportunity for seismic change at the UN, the Summit of the Future process. And we look at things like, if we were to open the Charter today, what would we need to ensure inclusivity and to ensure the rights and needs of all humanity and of our planet itself are met? Let's bear in mind that there were only 50 independent countries at the UN Charter Conference in 1950, 4 women present. And in many ways, of course, what came out of the World War II era and in shock and in response to the horrors and atrocities thereof was a form of victor's justice that became victor's governance. Even then, the Security Council system, for example, was highly controversial, with the P5 enshrining themselves as power keepers and in a position that would heretofore prohibit or has delimited the possibility of substantive reform conversations. Reform is on the table in September at the Summit of the Future. And we can talk a little bit about what some of the proposals our organization and other like-minded organizations would like to see advanced. One of those is a UN Parliamentary Assembly. I kind of liken the UN system as it is now to a 1.5-legged, 3-legged stool.
1.5
really,
legs.
yeah, and that's not very sustainable. That's
Not
not
very.
exactly the most structurally sound. And so our global governance system, I think that is a fitting metaphor. And the 1.5 legs are the executive, where you can think of the Security Council as a cabinet, if we're just going to use perhaps some metaphors that might be familiar, similes that might be familiar to US audiences. And we can think of the judicial arm, which I hope we'll get to talk about a little bit more, as one leg, which you'll see the Peace Palace behind me, where the International Court of Justice and the Permanent Court of Arbitration sit, as another, which is enshrined in the UN Charter, but which could be strengthened. But there's a third missing for those of us who studied civics and in elementary school and understand that a legislature that represents the interests of citizens is integral to a democratic foundation. And that's where a proposal like a UN Parliamentary Assembly of directly elected delegates comes in.
I'm so glad you mentioned the 5 victors of World War II. And of course, that was the United States, United Kingdom, France, China, and the old Soviet Union, the USSR. And the UN was created out of the ashes of World War II. The countries of the world, led primarily by Franklin Roosevelt, decided they really needed to create an organization that would bring the countries of the world together so that they would not go to war to settle their problems, but would come under one roof to try to discuss these issues logically. And of course, you mentioned the P5, the permanent 5 on the UN Security Council, which are today still the same 5, except it's no longer the USSR. It's now the Russian Federation that occupies one of those seats. But this is extremely important, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute after our break. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking with an expert on how we globally can deal with so many of the problems that are confronting all of us, all 8.2 billion people around the world. Rebecca Shute is the Executive Director of Citizens for Global Solutions. Rebecca, you mentioned the legislative and the judicial. We're down to about our last 15 minutes, so I'm going to let you pick which one you would like to start with. You tell me. You're going to bring it into the Summit for the Future, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, before the break, we were also talking about how we look at the UN Charter from civil society standpoint as a living document. And you mentioned President Roosevelt being integral in the shaping of the P5. Well, President Truman at the UN conference in San Francisco, I would like to read a quote from him, stated that this charter will be expanded and improved as time goes on. No one claims that it is now a final or perfect instrument. It has not been poured into any fixed mold. So, taking first the judicial branch, my organization, and indeed many that are now a part of this movement, were integral to the founding of the Coalition for the International Criminal Court. This was a coming together in the 1990s of, at that point, approximately 15 organizations that has blossomed into the world's largest coalition for international justice that now encapsulates more than 2,300 worldwide. The CICC not only willed the International Criminal Court into being, which former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who I know you have done an episode on in the past, called the Hope for All Humanity, but it continues to play an integral part in that court's evolution and is necessary to its legitimacy and credibility. We have a similar phenomenon now. I sit in front of the Peace Palace, virtually, of course, where the International Court of Justice sits. The International Court of Justice is envisioned by the UN Charter as the primary, indeed the indispensable, judicial institution of the global governance system, and it has jurisdiction over disputes among and between states, as opposed to the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction over individual criminal responsibility for the crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. We often see these institutions, and indeed regional institutions, and other courts and tribunals, such as the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, working together. And all are premised on the underlying bedrock principle of complementarity with domestic jurisdictions. So currently, my organization and others have banded together for a new campaign called Legal Alternatives to War, Law Not War, taking as its name the motto of our former National Advisory Council member, and until his death last year, the last living prosecutor at Nuremberg, Ben Ferencz. And this seeks to further the universality and effectiveness of the International Court of Justice as the means of resolution between disputes among states. And so that rather than go to war, rather than resort to armed conflict, disputes are handled in the building behind me. And we have seen, I think, some incredible and seminal opinions come out recently. I think some of you may be aware of the advisory opinion that led to a very, I think, earth-shattering, I'm not being hyperbolic here, decision on the legal responsibilities with regards to Israel for the consequences on the occupied states of Palestine. We also have several genocide cases currently before the court, and we have an unprecedented case, a request for an advisory opinion on the legal responsibilities with states with regards to climate change. And there you see the diversification of the court's jurisdiction and the number and types of situations and challenges that it is able to confront. And yet the court is limited because it does not have universal jurisdiction over all states and over all forms of dispute. Cases can come before the court in several ways. Either states can agree to bring an exceptional case by acceptance. It can be enshrined in a treaty by what we call a compromissory clause, that the ICJ is the method of dispute resolution, or there can be a request for an advisory opinion. Those are three. The fourth is when a state says that all disputes between it and other states will be handled by the ICJ. And that's called the Declaration of Universal Jurisdiction. And so far, only 74 out of 193 member states of the United Nations have done so. So this campaign aims to bolster that number and also bolster the use of advisory opinions and other means to make sure that the court can fulfill its full potential and mandate as envisioned by the UN Charter.
Which is very, very important. Now, the Summit of the Future, I alluded to that, and it's going to occur at the UN in late September, if memory serves. What do you think should be the outcome of that particular summit? What's the purpose of it, and why is it important?
So the Summit of the Future was envisioned by Secretary General Antonio Guterres as the next phase, an attempt for action-oriented global decision-making, and to really break the mold. We had the Millennium Development Goals, we have the Sustainable Development Goals. And originally the Summit of this Future was actually supposed to be held last year in tandem with the SDG conference. And in fact, I think it was for the betterment of all that they were decoupled. We know that the SDGs, while, ambitious and well-intentioned, are very far off from being realized. Only about 12% of the SDGs are on track, according to last year's UN report, and 50% show moderate or severe deviations from intended progress. So the Summit of the Future was intended to blaze another path, to show another way, to try to etch out another trail. And flows in large part from the new agenda for peace that the Secretary General promulgated last year. And because of this longer runway between 2023 and September 2024, civil society has had more opportunity, not ample opportunity, but more opportunity to be involved. The primary outcomes of the Summit of the Future are a Pact for the Future and two annexes, a Declaration on Future Generations and a Global Digital Compact. All three are consensus-based documents among states. The Pact for the Future has 5 chapters: financing and sustainable development, peace and security, global digital cooperation and scientific cooperation, youth and future generations, and global governance reform, the latter being very all-encapsulating. Civil society in tandem has articulated a People's Pact for the Future that, perhaps unsurprisingly, if I might be a little bit cynical there, in some areas goes a little bit further and pushes the needle a little bit more. And I should say, for complete disclosure, that I was a pen holder on one of the chapters on peace and security. At approximately the halfway point between these two summits, in May of this year in Nairobi, Kenya, more than 2,000 members of civil society, representatives of member states and international organizations all convened to try to articulate goals and outcomes in this pact process. But moreover, they coalesced and convened around impact coalitions. And so approximately 20 were formed in Nairobi, and there are approximately 20 because some have banded together and some have been diffused. But approximately 20 impact coalitions that are civil society endeavors to move the needle on specific areas of reform. And so you have impact coalitions, for example, that I co-lead on just institutions and the International Court of Justice, on the proposal for an international anti-corruption court, on earth governance, and others of which we're supportive, such as UN Charter reform and future generations. And then you have other coalitions dealing with everything from the role of civil society supporting arts and science and the burgeoning threats and opportunities posed by AI. And all of these while formed in the road to the summit of the future, we hope can have impact and indeed be an integral facet of a more dialectic state civil society dialogue thereafter.
You mentioned earlier, and I'm glad you did, you mentioned the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, and the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted in 2015, as I recall. And these are 17 logical, quantifiable goals that just about everybody is in agreement with, to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to empower women and girls, to combat climate change. And there are 13, 14 more of them, 17 in total, and they're absolutely critical. But the one thing I've discovered over the years, and maybe you have too, that so often that the people outside of the UN system, shall we say, or the foreign policy system, don't really know much about the Sustainable Development Goals, even though that so many of their organizations, faith-based groups, service clubs like Rotary, Kiwanis, Lions, they're all involved in helping to achieve these goals because they are so important. And that, to me, it reminds me of how important it is for all of us to try to learn more about what's happening and also to dispel a lot of the myths about the United Nations. I've heard for years about the black helicopters that have never yet descended on Washington, D.C. to take over the government, and they're not going to because there are no black helicopters. They talk about the UN being a one world government, which it's not. It's really an agreement amongst 193 countries to come together to focus on these problems. But these myths are just make a tremendous inroad, I think, with a lot of the right-wing, neoconservative, misinformed radio, TV, media outlets that are operating around the country. What has been your experience on these myths? And if someone asked you today, is the UN more relevant than ever, how would you respond to that?
So one of the other hats that I wear is which is not unrelated, the co-convener for the Washington Working Group for the International Criminal Court. And this is a difficult time for that institution and a difficult time from where I sit especially. And I do not sit in The Hague, actually. I sit in Washington, D.C., despite the background to the contrary. I think this is a wonderful metonym for the United States' role in global governance and the myths and misconceptions that percolate around our role and our involvement. So the United States was indispensable to the founding of the International Criminal Court. One of the members of our National Advisory Council is Ambassador David Sheffer, who is the first ambassador at large for global war crimes, now styled global criminal justice. And it's his name, his signature, that's inked on the Rome Statute that was signed but never ratified. And where we have had legislation in the last months that has passed the House of Representatives, where we would sanction, the United States would sanction US officials, ICC officials, and in fact, their US allies, and in fact, civil society members who cooperated if the ICC were to pursue certain cases. And I think we know what those cases are. There cannot be selective justice, and there cannot be any threats to the autonomy or independence of judicial institutions, whether they be international or otherwise. And this is what we are seeing today. And the misconceptions about the ICC, that it is coming after US service persons, that it is a politicized court that is only handling certain investigations and certain prosecutions, are what we also see about the UN system writ large. And there are not enough Citizens for Global Solutions out there, and our allies and our partners to try to confront every single piece of mis or disinformation. But the closer that you get to these institutions and the more that you see their work and their vitality and their indispensability, I think that some of those concerns can hopefully dissipate. Now, when we look at the ongoing crises in the world, I think we understand that what the situation from Ukraine to Sudan to Myanmar to the Middle East is beyond the ken of one government, one national government, or even a coalition to address, and that it is not only a matter of addressing and responding to immediate need, but is a matter of seeing this as a generational project, that intergenerational trauma lives on in the wake of conflict, that climate change is posing an existential threat to citizens around the world, where very, acutely, their countries are disappearing in the case of some small Pacific Island states, for example. How are we going to address those problems alone? How are we going to address those problems without meaningful global cooperation? And that global cooperation does need to be predicated on global trust, and global trust therefore needs to be predicated on accountability, hence the judicial architecture.
Exactly. That was a perfect way to answer that question. And I am so glad you did it. But Rebecca, shoot, this is such an important topic. And as is often said, if we didn't have the UN today, we'd have to recreate it tomorrow. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.